Hello and welcome to the Worn and Wound podcast. My name is Zach Kazan. I'm the managing editor at Worn and Wound. Really fun show for you today. Very pleased to be joined by Tommy DeMauro, a Worn and Wound contributor making his first appearance at long last on the Worn and Wound podcast. Tommy, how's it going?
Very good. How you doing, Zach?
I'm doing great. It's wonderful to see you. It's wonderful to have you on the podcast. We've been sort of like talking about this, I feel like for months, because you write about such an interesting sort of like niche topic within the watch world. And I so enjoy your articles. I've been wanting to get you on the podcast to talk about them and your background. So I'm really glad we're able to do this. So thank you for
thank you for inviting me. I've been waiting a long time, so I'm really happy to be here.
Absolutely. So we're going to just kind of talk a little bit about, so your kind of like place in the watch industry, what you're interested in, and maybe some of your some of the articles that you've written for us over the last several months. Before we do any of that, of course, we always do a wrist check. So Tommy, I got to ask, what are you wearing today?
Well, contrary to what I'm assuming is going to be popular belief, I'm not wearing a Seiko today. I decided to switch it up a little bit.
Okay.
I put on a Hamilton. It's the Fontaine Blue. It's such an interesting K shape. I'm sure you've seen them in the past. This is the day date variant, which is a little bit more rare than the normal versions are. Mm-hmm. Of course, the chronograph is like the most sought after version. But I bought this from an older gentleman online. He bought it original. He bought it brand new. So I was happy to get it in hand. It's a really interesting, almost like a monoblock case. Whenever you try to remove the case back, it's just the entirety of the movement, and the glass and everything comes separate from the case itself. Super, super interesting watch. Really great movement. A lot of fun to have in the collection. Just another weird oddity, shape, size. I love it.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. That's a weird case shape for sure. I kind of like the way those like oblong case shapes wear. I've had a couple of those over the years in my collection. I had a Zenith Port Royal from the 70s that had kind of like a similar shape that I really love. There's just something so unique about like how a case that's like kind of shaped, in that way, in that like, kind of like exaggerated rectangular or oval shape wears. It's very, very cool.
Yeah, exactly. For me, it's like one of those things where I have a lot of watches that are obviously, the normal round shape or even some tanks, so square shaped. But I always gravitate towards the watches that have the weird case shapes because there's nothing ever like it once you get them on wrist. It's like once you get the weird shapes, you can't really go back from them. So, yeah.
Yep, for sure. I'm wearing a watch that does not have a weird case shape. This is actually a watch that I found in a drawer that I had kind of forgotten I owned. I'm wearing it's a Timex watch from several years ago, made with Nigel Caborn, who's a fashion guy, like menswear, designer guy. He did several collaborations with Timex, and I wrote about this watch for Worn and Wound. I'll put the link in the show notes in like 2019, and I remember. This was the first watch, wasn't the last watch, but it was the first watch that I ever bought because of like learning about it through an article that I had written for Worn and Wound. So like, I thought it always just felt like notable to me for some reason. Cause like eventually you do this job long enough, you like convince yourself, oh, that's a cool thing. I'm going to buy that watch that I am like, covering. So like, I always sort of like remembered that about this watch. It's they call it the referee watch because it has like a 45-minute like soccer timer kind of like, design on the dial. It's not a chronograph. So like it can't really be used as a soccer timer in a practical sense. I just like the colors. It has like this like kind of cool like red tone and like a cream base style. I'll put a photo of it on in the show notes. But this is the first time in like years that I like have worn this watch. So
I feel like the hyperfixation, especially with like writing about a watch and then doing more research on it, and you kind of get down that rabbit hole. I've done it with so many of the watches that I've written about in my articles, finding different variants of those watches. It's just, that's like part of the fun of it, especially with the vintage stuff like I do. I mean, there's models that kind of appear at random almost every day, and it's such a nice feeling to be able to like uncover a new one. And then of course you have to buy it, which doesn't really help when you have a massive collection, but it's part of the game.
You don't have to buy it, but we end up doing it anyway, which is part of the strange disease that we all suffer from. So Tommy, let's get right into it. So you've been writing for Worn and Wound for I think going on like a year
Mhm.
now. It's got to be pretty close to a year, if not a full year. And you write about like a very specific type of like vintage or neo vintage watch that's like usually pretty
Mhm.
affordable, and pretty like under the radar, not often collected. But I feel like you're identifying these watches and like also identifying that there's like a real like collector community around them that sometimes like might be
Mhm.
ignored. So I'm curious, like how you got into this sort of side of the hobby, um, and what is your kind of like watch like story, like how you got into the hobby in
Yeah,
general.
in terms of overall start, I think it was 12 or 13 years old. I went to a local flea market, found a basket of silverware and a bunch of other junk. And at the bottom of that basket was a few different Timex watches, a couple of mechanicals, and a digital. It's an SSQ. It's super, super interesting, like late 70s, early 80s digital. I've always had a soft spot for them, I think, simply because of they pretty much what got me into the hobby. But from there, I brought them home, looked up how to change a battery, found out that that one was pretty easy to change, put it in, popped right to life. And then the mechanical watches, I wound up both of them. They both sprung to life too. So I think from there, it's kind of where it started. And then my collection began with a lot of Timex and Casio, and I still have a ton of Timex and Casio in my collection. But now it's definitely branched out more into specifically Seiko, I think a lot more than any other brand.
Mm-hmm.
But during that whole journey, I think I realized that I loved to have, the DW3000 and the classic watches that everyone knows and loves to this day. But I think I started to realize how different models out there, different unique models that no one really knows about, have just as many
Mm-hmm.
features, have similar styles to them, but are just a little bit different. And I liked that uniqueness a lot. And I think from there, I just really dove down that rabbit hole, found a ton of different watches that really spoke to me. I think around COVID was where I started to really dive down that unique section of watch collecting. I think it was just because of sitting at home doing research on eBay, not having much else to do. So eBay
Right.
shopping really became a big thing for me, especially eBay selling as well. Buying and selling watches, getting new stuff in, getting old stuff out. And from there, I think my main, if I were to put some sort of descriptor on what my collection truly is or what I like to collect, are watches that people might have missed over time or forgotten about, and stuff that I just think is visually really appealing, whether it's different colors, different shapes, symmetry, anything like that. But as someone who has been a college student for a long time, hasn't had a ton of money to put towards watches or hobbies at all,
Mm-hmm.
finding these watches that are under $100, under $200, under $300, to me, that's what affordable is. Obviously that varies. I know that in one of the recent episodes you guys had a big talk about budget watches and things like that, and
Yep.
everyone has a different definition of budget. But as a long time student who doesn't have a lot of disposable income, to me budget was as cheap as you can get, but I wanted to be able to get something that was really cool, really unique, and vintage, because I love all those aspects of watch collecting.
Yeah, like it struck me very early on from when we first kind of like got in touch, and you pitched me several stories that like you were really plugged into this like part of the community that like frankly like I don't have a lot of familiarity with. Like you pitch me watches that are often like not familiar to me, that are like both genuinely rare in that like they're not, the production numbers were not high, and people like don't really know about them, but they're also affordable, like sometimes very affordable, like by almost any definition. And that to me is like a really unique thing, because usually we associate rarity with a higher
Mhm.
cost. Like that's it's actually like a pretty big talking point in the watch world right now. It's something that's people are discussing at a, quite a bit, the premium that we pay for rare references. And like I mean, you've written about the Seikos and this Bradley time division watch, that has like an
Mhm.
Epcot dial. That like these are not high production like they're genuinely
Mhm.
rare, but they're also like accessible if you know how to look for them. It seems like the search is a pretty big
Mhm.
part of
Yeah.
it for you. Is that
Yeah,
accurate?
I think it's the thrill of the chase. Obviously, is a big part of it. And I think what I do with collecting is I find watches that are rare, like you had said, low production numbers, all of that, but they're not expensive because people don't really know how rare they are. And that's why
Right.
I had mentioned it in a few of my other articles about how to look for certain watches. And sometimes the more brief and kind of vague your search term is, the better your results are actually going to be, or vice versa occasionally. I think playing around with those
Mm-hmm.
search terms, playing around with those like Boolean operators and stuff like that on eBay and all the other auction websites really helps to be able to find some of these watches. Because again, I don't have a lot of disposable income, but what I do know is that I want to be able to like preserve these watches that were just completely forgotten about over time. And I think having that ability to find these watches, source them out, and then write about them for Worn and Wound has just been like a dream come true. I
Mm-hmm.
want to be able to bridge the gap between rarity and affordability for a lot of collectors out there that want something different, not just the standard, Timex Indiglo watch or the standard Casio DW3000.
Yeah. So is it the rarity then, or the obscurity? Maybe that's a
Mm-hmm.
better term for what we're talking about here. That is like the main appeal for you, or does it have to have some sort of like aesthetic
I
quality,
think that
or functionality to it as
Yeah,
well?
I think it's definitely a combination of both to a certain extent, which I know is kind of a cop out answer. But I think the aesthetics of it are probably the most important, if I'm going to be honest, because I think that especially in some of my most recent articles, like with the Timex Tri Pre, that one was
Mm-hmm.
it's not that rare to find. And it's not like this like oddity that is really hard to kind of come by, but it's just the way that it looks. It doesn't look like a lot of other stuff that's on the market. It looks like it's age. And to me, with vintage watches, I want something that's almost like a period piece. Like I know the big bulky 1970s gold tone watches, a lot of people steer clear from. But for me, if it's achieving that look and it's doing it in almost like a hyper stereotypical way, that's what I love about it. That's what I want to. That's what I
Yeah.
want to preserve.
Yeah. Some of my favorite articles that you've written have been these articles on um like these like interesting digital watches. I'm thinking of like the Timex Skiathlon, which is a watch that like I was not familiar with at
Mhm.
all before you brought it to my attention. And this seems like such an artifact of like a particular time, like really from like my childhood, like the 80s and 90s. So one thing I wanted to ask you, like, is that a vintage watch? Like, should we be like classifying a watch from that era at this point as vintage? Has enough changed in like modern watches, contemporary watches, to like make that like a, is there like a clear dividing line that like makes something like the Skiathlon or the Tri Pre that you mentioned like vintage at this point? And does that distinction
Yeah,
matter?
I think so. For those who may not know, so I just recently graduated with my master's in public history. I did for undergrad, I did English and history. So like history is my bread and butter, pretty much, and it's a topic that is talked about pretty frequently. Like what is history? What's vintage? That type of thing. I
Mm-hmm.
think that the cutoff that some people use is like a 20-year kind of radius. So like something from 2005 today would be considered vintage to a certain extent. Um, it depends on what the item is. It depends on what the genre of creation of whatever it is to me. But I think definitely with the Skiathlon, I would consider that vintage. If it's an aesthetic, if it's an item that is being replicated today to almost kind of pander and benefit off of nostalgia purposes, I think that's definitely where you start to see like vintage pop up more and more. So even with like 2000s fashion, for example, is becoming a really big hit with like younger crowds now. So that's vintage
Sure.
to them. That's aesthetic. That's cool. So to me, that's when I start to consider it to be vintage, because it's like if people are looking back at it fondly to be some like rose tinted glasses or nostalgia, to me that's when I mark something as vintage. So even those weird bulky early 2000s watches, like I know a lot of people collect the Nike watches now from the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
Those I would consider vintage. I think that 20-year ish gap is where I'd start to consider it vintage.
Well, that makes me feel very old because that we're talking about like my college years, basically, like the early aughts, and that feels like it was just last
hmm
week in a lot of ways. So that's terrifying. But like I see what you mean. Like it's definitely um, like it's regardless of what we call it, like it's certainly like a different era,
yeah.
of like of design and of the culture, just sort of like in general. And yeah, like we look at those things in a different way because of their age. I don't know how rose tinted my glasses are. Like some of those designs
Hmm.
I think are beautiful and like really like
Hmm.
appealing. Some of them like kind of make me cringe. Like it's sort of like a like case by case. Is there something like is there a quality about like designs from that era that you look for that you find particularly appealing? Something specific like the color or the case shapes or what do you look for in watches from
I
that
think
era?
that specifically looking at the 80s and the 90s, obviously colors I think is a big thing. You have your neons and your pastels, which are kind of have a
Hmm.
foothold in that era of design. But also asymmetry I think is really important. I think so many people get bogged down to a certain extent with watch design with symmetry, having everything be perfectly organized. And I have a lot of watches in my collection that are like that. One of my favorite quartz chronograph movements is the Citizen 3531. I have a few different examples of it in different watches, and the reason why I like it is because of how symmetrical it is. It's a 3 subdial dial, and two of the subdials are in the top left and top right, and then one in the middle and the bottom. And it's just the way that it looks is perfect to me. But in a way, the asymmetry is also extremely interesting to me. That's why the skiathlon was of interest to me. How it has the giant buttons on the one
Hmm.
side and nothing on the other, or with the Tripri, it's the exact same way, where it has the slanted display instead of the regular straight one that you see. It's these little idiosyncrasies I think that really make me interested in a watch because of just they make them look unique. It's hard to replicate some of these looks, especially from that 80s 90s era. I mean, we're starting to see some nowadays, not nearly as much though back then. I think now it's just kind of like an homage to that era of design. But just these
Right.
weird little idiosyncrasies, I think, to me, is what really makes me interested in that era.
Yeah. Um, one of my favorite articles that you've written for us recently is your piece on the Seiko Orange
Mhm.
Monster, which is a watch that's near and dear to my heart. I've owned a handful of them over the years. It's sort of a watch that like was a gateway for me into like watch enthusiast circles. Can you talk a little bit about that watch specifically and its like importance in sort of like this type of watch that you are interested in collecting? It kind of feels like I don't know, like the alpha
Mhm.
watch sort of like this sort of like group of it's like it's Seiko, so it's like mainstream, but it's also weird, and yet it's still like it's pretty well
Mhm.
known like among enthusiasts, but there's also like all these variants and like weird things about it. What is about the orange monster do you find
The
appealing?
color I think is incredible. That pop of orange is just
Hmm.
fantastic. I have a Bull of a Devil Diver, the reissue, the 666, and that orange just absolutely pops. But it pops in a different way to me. It's almost like a neon orange dial with the reissues. But with the Seiko Orange
Hmm.
Monster, it's toned down enough to where you can match it with a lot of different outfits, even how big it is and how almost gaudy the first gens are with the stainless steel bezel on them. But
Hmm.
it's I have found it fascinating since starting to do research for that article how many variants there are. Like you said, there's a website.
So
I
many.
think I linked it in the actual article, but there's a website where a dedicated Seiko collector documented every single variant that's ever existed of the Monster series, and you can just keep scrolling on that website and it just keeps going. I
Yeah.
was shocked at how many were available. And whenever I bought it, I had got it for a really good deal, as is most of the watches that I've purchased that I've gotten into the collection. I have always paid way under market, just some like weird happenstance eBay listings. So whenever I got it in, it had no strap on it. And I had originally just thought, oh, these just came on rubber. And then I found out that, oh, they came on the bracelet too. But it's not just, it's the same model on a bracelet. It's a completely different model number on the bracelet than it is from the rubber, which then opens a
Yeah.
whole other world up to different pictures if I search for different terms, like we were talking about before. So for me, Seiko has just been a fantastic brand to dive into because of the reasons like you had said. It's a brand that everyone knows and loves, and there's a lot of models that people know about, but there's also a ton of models that people just don't even know exist because of how many models they released. It's the same with Timex, the same with Casio too. But
Sure.
with Seiko, it's just been a really fun journey to find these watches that are iconic, like the Orange Monster or the SKX series, but then also kind of find their weird like cousins or brothers. Like that's what I had named
Yeah.
the first article that I'd written for Worn and Wound was the like the little Arnie, or like this just like this weird
Yeah.
quasi maybe in the same series, but not really because it's not in the same advertising. It's just such a fun rabbit hole to kind of dissect and look through and find all these weird models out there.
Yeah, with that with that Arnie watch, or the cousin of Arnie,
Yeah.
or brother of Arnie, whatever we're calling it, and the monster, and also like SKX derived references. I feel like you could have like a pretty fulfilling like collector's life, like just collecting like orange
Yeah.
monsters, or like just collecting like Arnie
Hmm.
variants and watches like derived off of that, because there's just like so many when you factor in color variants and different regional releases, and like also like updates to the collection throughout the years. One thing I wanted to ask you about with respect to the monster specifically is, on a previous episode of the podcast, I was talking about like an older, like second gen
Hmm.
monster that I currently own, and how it's just like it has this like feeling to it, this like charm to it that like the modern ones just
Hmm.
don't. There's some sort of, the modern ones have this almost kind of like antiseptic kind of like feeling to them. I'm wondering if that's something you've noticed, if you've ever like held like a modern
Hmm.
one and an older one in your hand, and like can you add to the to
Yeah.
that like conversation, like what is it to you that makes like the older ones, the early like first and second gen monsters, different from the ones that are in production
I
now?
think weight is a really big part of it. I know that with certain watches and certain styles, you want as low of a weight as possible. That's why they make titanium watches. For me, sometimes though, if I have a diver, I want it to be heavy. I want to be able to feel it, make sure
Hmm.
it feels like a tactile watch to wear on wrist. I think weight is definitely a part of it, and I also think the originality side of it too. With the line of Seiko fives that replaced the XKX series, it was it was interesting to see them. I'm not a big fan of the five logo at all. I've never really been, but
Hmm.
with that line, it's like we can see that they're interested in like kind of beckoning back to their history and looking back at these designs that have stood the test of time. But then in the same way, it just feels like almost a cop out of sorts. And I think that there's ways of paying homage to previous models in a tasteful manner. But I think that especially with like the SKX series, at the end of the day, it's a black diver's watch. It's a yellow diver's
Yeah.
watch. It's an orange dial diver's watch. It's simplistic, but it gets the job done. And I think the reason why the SKX 007, for example, is held to such esteem is that obviously it wasn't the first black dial diver watch, but it was one of the first diver watches where it was semi-affordable. It felt tactile enough. You could go diving with it. You could trust it. But it was also a Seiko, so it was had the robust 7S26 movement in it. It felt like it was going to withstand stuff. And if it didn't withstand damage from diving or beating it up, you could go out and buy another one feasibly or get a new movement for it relatively feasibly compared to a vintage Swiss diver watch or something of that nature. So that feeling of originality, I've kept referring to throughout this episode so far, originality is really important. And I think looking at the newer Seiko divers, it just feels like that spark is just been lost over time.
Yeah, I think the those Seikos from a previous generation, I've been thinking about this a
Hmm.
lot, and I think that like a big part of it is those older watches existed before a period of like watch enthusiasm as we know
Hmm.
it today. Like obviously there were, like people who collected watches and loved watches, but the watches existed in a world where like there wasn't a lot of like watch
Hmm.
media, or at least it wasn't everywhere, and there wasn't like a pervasive collector culture that you couldn't escape, on social media. And that sort of environment creates a situation where I think, Seiko's product like fundamentally changes. They start trying to make products like for
Hmm.
collectors, or like for a specific type of consumer, rather than like just making a straightforward dive
Yeah.
watch like the SKX. Like the Seiko 5 sports watches that were introduced a few years ago were, I feel like they were very specifically a play to like, appeal to like a new collector who maybe didn't like know enough to understand like the key differences between that
Hmm.
watch and an SKX. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like it's
Uh,
it's just like it's a watch that like represents a
mhm.
ploy, rather than just a watch that exists because it's a, because this is a diver and some people need divers and that's what we're gonna
Yeah, I
produce.
think in terms of looking at the whole like budget sphere of watchmaking, because that's what I've known for all of my life, and I'll probably just stay within that realm because I've already have
Mhm.
more than enough watches within that realm to even start going down the path of luxury watches and things of that nature. But I think a hill that I will forever die on is that in today's day and age with watch collecting and with watchmaking, every brand is an enthusiast's brand because
Mhm.
it's a dying art to a certain extent because it's been outmoded, as all of us know, with Apple watches, with our smartphones. With technology advancing, watches aren't that necessary, which hurts to say, and
Sure.
it hurts to hear as a collector. But at the end of the day, the reason why we love collecting them is because of that reason, because we don't have to. We enjoy the way they look on our wrists. We enjoy having them as an accessory for our day to day. But I think that you can't look at the watchmaking sphere anymore and think that there's like a general consumer's basis, which, I mean, of course there are, but in terms of, even with Seiko, Seiko is a budget brand, but a lot of their models still cost quite a bit of money to just kind of shell out for a watch
Mhm.
if you don't really necessarily need one. So, I mean, I would say probably, Casio, Timex, those brands would probably be like a consumer's area of watchmaking. But 98% of other watch brands are an enthusiast brand at this point, I would say. And I think it's just because of technology advancing and, watches becoming semi outmoded to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's a common refrain,
Hmm.
in our world, but like no one needs these
Yeah.
things, like watches are like are superfluous,
Hmm.
objects, because we, at one point certainly like there were a necessity for
Hmm.
certain people. I would argue that like even that is sort of like, you know, uh, played out of proportion a little bit. Like even at like in the heyday of like like American watchmaking when millions of pocket watches were being produced, like not everyone needed one. Like you just needed to be like around
Hmm.
someone who like had a watch to like understand like what time it is. And yeah, it's like we're in a different era, and I like that take that like every every brand is an enthusiast brand because you have to kind of like make a decision
Hmm.
to buy a watch that's like not a smart
Yeah.
watch at this point.
Yeah, and I think that
Yeah.
even looking at as someone, like looking from an outsider's perspective, for example, if you're going to go purchase a watch, 9 times out of 10 nowadays it's like either a gift or it's marking an occasion. It's a investment that marks something, or it's a nice gesture to do for someone else. I mean, you look at like the 1950s, for example, and you have brands like Timex where they're making watches because a guy going to work that day needs to know the time, needs to know what time it is whenever he's in his car on the way to work or when he's on the way
Yeah.
home from rush hour, stuff like that. And I think that looking at watches nowadays, because they've become outmoded, it's hard to shell out money sometimes as just someone who doesn't have a lot of disposable income. Going to a jewelry store or even going to a Macy's and looking at the jewelry counter and seeing one of the newer Seiko divers that's on the market for $400, $500, $600. That's an investment at that point. It's not just like oh, this would be a cool piece to add to my fashion and my outfit every day, I think so.
Yeah, no, it's like I mean that's a significant amount of money for a lot of for I for a lot of
Hmm.
people for sure. It's like it's not a trivial it's never a watch is never a trivial
Hmm.
purchase. I think in 2025 it's something that like always requires a certain amount of thought regardless of the price point you're shopping at. Like it's if you're a collector especially like you're that's sort of like the nature of collecting. Like you're putting it every purchase through like a certain kind of like like a set of
Hmm.
standards. Like does it meet the needs of my collection? Is it what I'm looking for?
Hmm.
Yeah, that's so yeah. And I hear what you're saying about like going to Macy's and seeing like the new stuff. I can remember like going into like Macy's and looking at the like the Seiko section, and like it seemed like they were just like more
Hmm.
accessible. Like now like they're just like they're shinier and they're more
Exactly.
expensive, and like because they've gone up market a
Well,
little
and I
bit.
think that even
Um
on my side of the collecting sphere, I go into a Macy's or I go into a jewelry store, and because I'm so
yeah.
in that like affordable range or in that vintage range, I'll see models that I didn't even know were released by these brands. And I'm like, oh, like that's interesting. And then I'll see the MSRP on them, and I'm like, that's probably why I never knew about them.
Right, right. Um Tommy, I wanted to ask you about, you wrote an article for us on the idea of patina and watch
Yeah.
damage. And I really love this article. I think it's like a really interesting sort of like meditation on like what the difference between like genuine patina and damage actually is. And I'm wondering like, first of all, I'll link to the article in the show notes. There's a lot of you did a lot of really nice photography for this
Thank you.
article in particular that like really captures a lot of the like the wear and tear that these vintage watches pick up. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what that line is for
Mm.
you, and as a collector, like what are you looking for when you're looking at a watch, a vintage watch that has some like some obvious wear to it, and where do you like what's the cutoff point for you? Like when does damage become something that you really want to avoid versus patina that might be appealing to you as a collector
Yeah,
aesthetically?
I think the main thing, I think I talk about this in the article as well, is just uniformity. I think that if you have a
Yeah.
watch that's pristine and has a giant gash on the dial or on the case or something like that, that's just general damage. And sometimes you can get that, fixed. If it's on the crystal, replace the crystal. If it's on the dial, you're kind of out of luck to a certain extent, unless it's a really expensive dial and you really want to get it refinished and things like that. So for me, it's definitely the uniformity aspect of it. And I think that the reason why it's such a fine line between patina and damage is because it changes for everyone, obviously. Like as I think everyone can see in the comments of that article or on the post that I had made on Instagram about that whole article, I got a lot of comments from people people saying that to them the Pogue that I had referenced in the images and in the article, that was too far gone. It has way too much damage on it.
Hmm.
That one's just broken pretty much, or that one is beyond repair. It shouldn't be worn. It needs so many new parts. But then there was also some people that would go on and say that, well, actually, I think that looks really cool. It's not what you see every day. It's something that looks different. Again, the uniqueness aspect to it. So I think
Right.
if that watch that I had featured in the article had a fantastic stellar dial on it, but the hands were half rotted away and the case had giant gashes in it, well, then I'd probably relook at that watch and think, well, should I go get the case repolished? Should I go do something about the handset and get an aftermarket set? But the way that watch looks and how every part looks like it wore together is what makes it really important. And I think that's why
Hmm.
I don't want to touch it. Obviously, mechanically, I'll get it serviced, get the movement up in tip top shape. But in terms of the aesthetics of it, that's why I love that watch so much, is because it matches itself. It matches its age. It matches whoever had worn that in its previous life, actually wore it. They actually used that watch for
Right.
the purposes of telling time, and no matter what circumstance they were in. And that's why I have a pristine example of the 6139 Pogue, but I love to put it next to this beat up version to show that like these are watches that were for the most part made in the same era, made in the same year sometimes, and they've lived
Hmm.
completely different lives. But that's what makes it interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So where do you stand on? I assume most collectors who either collect exclusively vintage or dabble in vintage, I think probably come down on along the side of like originality in terms of like not not polishing the
Hmm.
case, not retouching the dial, is of kind of like the utmost importance. Is that a belief that you kind of like ascribe to? Are there like limits to that? Like, or will you pass on a watch that's been polished or had a dial touch up? How important is that to you? And does it like vary from watch
Hmm.
to watch? I imagine it's probably a sliding scale depending on like rarity and other
Yeah,
factors.
I think that I love to be a part of the Seiko collecting community, but it's also on at times an extremely toxic environment as well, because some people
Sure.
will live and die on the hill of, if there's a singular replacement part on it, if the case was touched with a buffing wheel, I don't want it. It's not original. Get rid of it. I think that with a lot of vintage watches, to a certain extent, you have to be okay with replacement parts. Obviously, crystals. I think I mentioned this in the article too. Crystals are just crystals. To a lot of people, you just
Right.
get rid of them. But to the Seiko collecting community, you would polish those. You would try to get them to as best shape as you can to keep everything as original as humanly possible. To me, there's There is a line. Crystals I can replace. That's no problem to me. Handsets to a certain extent, I'm fine with replacing. Dials are really important because dials are so obviously fake if you get a replacement one. So speaking from experience with the 6139, 6138 Seiko community, there are these tiny tips that you can look for to see if it's a replacement dial. The font's a little bit different. The number hits on the line where on the originals it doesn't hit on the line, that type of thing. It's one of those things where it's like ignorance is bliss in those circumstances. If you don't do the
Sure.
research and you don't do all of this investigation, you'll live your life thinking that, well, it looks perfect to me. It looks like it's exactly how it should look. But then once you start doing that research and finding this little tiny difference that shows that it was touched up or it's a replacement, to me, that's whenever it's hard to look past. So specifically with the Seikos, I am like that, where I want everything to be as original as possible. But if it's a vintage watch that it's just hard to find parts for, or it's, from a brand that no one really knows about, but it's an ETA movement, so I can swap parts out pretty easily, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, man, I've been in that situation where I've owned a vintage watch and I thought I had something that was all original, and I was then told by someone who I trust that like actually like no, like that dial's been
Hmm.
redone, or like the case has been recut or whatever. And man, like that is a punch in the gut. Like that makes like even if you like tell yourself like you don't really like care too much about that, and you just like want to wear the watch for the sake of wearing the watch, like thinking you had one thing and then realizing you have another is like a very tough pill
Hmm.
to swallow. And I think that's one of the like the real challenges of like vintage watch collecting is you kind of have to decide like how important that is to you. Like every day that you collect, like you have to kind of like be willing to take a certain amount of risk, and also like invest a lot of time and energy into like gaining the knowledge to be able to like identify these
Hmm.
things. And that's another thing I wanted to ask you about. Maybe this is a good way to shift gears, is like tell me about like the research process for these watches, because it's honestly like something I'm blown away by in your writing. Is like you really like you basically are writing like buying guides, collecting guides to these watches that hopefully people find useful. And like I think we're all pretty used to the idea of like Rolex collectors, Patek Philippe collectors, kind of like providing information to the collecting community on like what to look for, and like the different like the different details on different variants, so people like understand what they're bidding on at auction, for example. um you write about watches that are in a very different category, but I think still have like just as many little like idiosyncrasies that are worth like pointing out. So like where do you like find the information on these watches? How do you do that research? Is it like just I assume I know that there's a collecting community. It's just a matter of like kind of leaning on them to like to gain knowledge. And are you still like uncovering things as you research these watches and discover new
Yeah,
pieces?
I think I've lived my life and gone down this whole collecting journey in watches under the mindset of wanting to help other people that are in my position, don't have a ton of money to spend on watches, are really interested in watches and want to learn more about them. And I think that there's always been fantastic sources of information on watch collecting and vintage watches and all that stuff. But I think this affordable range is just hard to come by with a lot of like actual published material. So yes, like you had said, watch blogs, Reddit feeds. I mean Reddit posts, all of that type of stuff, Instagram posts too. You begin to connect and find other collectors that are super interested in these niche kind of side spheres of watch collecting, and then the more you get into contact with them, the more you can find out about certain watches. So all of my research comes from online materials. It's hard to find any sort of legitimate archival materials unless you go to the actual headquarters of these companies, which 98% of the time they won't let you in anyways, so you just have to kind of depend
Hmm.
on there are an occasional older watch buying guides out there, like these big catalogs, but even in those it's Rolex, IWC, Patek, these really high end
Hmm.
watches, because people back then weren't going to publish materials on how to find this one really weird Seiko model that everyone forgot about. So yeah, blogs, other collectors, Instagram posts, things like that. And to answer your other question about kind of uncovering new material, it happens quite literally almost every time I write an article for Worn and Wound. I'll find something. I think actually my first article, I had sent it in to you to get published, and then as soon as it got published, I was like, wait, there's like 8 other references I forgot to include in this, and I found all this information out the night that it got posted. But that was almost like the initial learning curve. And I'm glad it happened on the first article, because then I just kind of realized this is going to happen every time I write an article because of how weird
For
these
sure.
watches are. I mean, so for example, that H601, cousin of Arnie, little Arnie, whatever we like to call it. I wrote that entire article, did all the research, and then I think it was 5 or 6 months ago now, someone had posted one of those watches on eBay, and I instantly bought it up because I have, of course, a save search for it. And whenever I got it in, I realized it's a reference that I had never seen before. It was never in any of the online materials that I'd ever found, not in any ads, not in any other collectors' collections, anything like that. It has almost like a cross check dial on it. It doesn't have the text to indicate what the buttons do and the functionality. It was one that I had really never seen before. And since then, I did a hours of research and found like maybe 1 or 2 other examples. But even this far removed from writing that initial article, I had found and come across this model that I didn't even know existed. And I was the one that did all of the research on this model before even writing the article, probably more than anyone else has ever done on this watch before. But it's what makes it fun. It's what makes it interesting, is to keep it active and make that search active.
Also, that's like honestly, like that's a real feather in your cap too, to be able to say like you've done more research on like the cousin of
Mm-hmm.
Arnie than anyone else has ever done before. Like I think that's like, I mean you're a historian, like so I think that's like that's
Yeah,
important.
thank you. Yeah, just keeping that originality, making sure that people know that these models exist. When up until with most of the watches that I've written about, up until me purchasing the watch, I didn't even know it existed. So now that I know it exists, I'm like, well, I want other people to know how cool this is too. So that's why I write the articles.
Yeah. In it kind of like segueing from that, like the idea of like, the community aspect of this and helping the community. Let's talk about some practical advice for people who might want to dabble in this sort of like, like super affordable, like vintage, neo vintage category. What's the best place to start? How do you like kind of, you know, kind of like figure out your taste in these? Is it just a matter of like taking the plunge and like buying some watches and like seeing what you like? What do you need to like look out for once you start kind of like searching for these things on eBay? What do you need to be careful of and watch
I
for?
think that looking back at the way that I started my collection and my collecting journey and where I am now, I took the route of just like buying watches I thought looked cool and were relatively affordable, and then amassing this massive collection of watches. And I regret. I think I had talked about this in our, I think, end of year article, that the big group editorial that we had all written. That I look at my collection sometimes and I feel bad because I don't wear like 70% of it. I have, I think, over 120, 130 watches right now. And most of them just kind of sit there because I have other watches that I absolutely love to wear. But then when I think about getting rid of those watches, I'm like, well, I don't really want to get rid of those watches because it was something that either has a memory connected to it, or the hunt of finding that watch was a memory in and of itself. So I think that in terms of suggestions for other people that want to get into the side of collecting that I'm in, if you have some disposable income that you can put forward, have save searches on just men's watches or anything like that. Keep it really brief, keep it short, and you'll have a ton of results come up. But just every now and again, when you're, don't have anything else to do, instead of scrolling through Instagram or TikTok, refresh the eBay search. See what comes up instantly. There's so many watches that I've bought within a split second of it being listed. And it was one of those things where it was split judgment. I could have got the watch in and it could have been 15 different, in 15 different pieces, completely broken. So just taking that risk. And I think that for me personally, that risk was always like under $50. If it was under $50, I was like, well, maybe I can't go out to dinner with my friends that week. Maybe I shouldn't splurge on going to the movies this week and doing this because, well, I'm taking the shot on this watch. If it comes in and it's broken, that sucks. If it comes in and it's great, that was a fantastic buy. So I think that that's what I
Yeah.
recommend if you have some sort of relative disposable income, is just taking those shots on those under $50, or if you don't have a lot, under $25. Keep it, keep it as small as you have to. But that's how I got interested in all these weird watches, was because I found them for affordable prices and then did a ton of research on them and was like, this is incredible. I bought this for, the price of me going to Red Robin, but now I have a watch that I can have in the
Yeah.
collection for years and years that people didn't even know it existed.
Yeah. No, that's kind of a fun idea. So just kind of like pick a dollar amount that you're willing to kind of like, potentially throw
Mm-hmm.
away on a watch, and just like see what you can
Yeah.
get for, for $25 or for $50 or whatever that number is for you. It's a kind of a fascinating, way to just like experiment. Is it mostly eBay for you, or do you ever dabble with like Reddit or the watch forums, or is eBay really kind of like the way to kind of like look for these like super affordable
eBay
watches?
is usually the way that I'll go. It just has a lot of fail safes in place in case someone's legitimately trying to scam you, obviously, which happens on eBay too.
Mm-hmm.
But eBay definitely. Mercari as well. I use Mercari quite a
Mm-hmm.
bit. It's kind of ebbed and flowed in terms of popularity. I think right now not a lot of people post on it, but for a while, especially during COVID, a lot of people were posting on there. So I just have a few save searches, refresh it every now and again. But those two are usually the biggest. Etsy will occasionally have something random pop up. I got my
Mm.
original 1977 or 1978 Timex Q Falcon Eye, the blue dial. I got an original copy of that, an original example of that on Etsy for like $20 in a random lot that someone had posted. So it's just keeping your eyes open whenever you have some time. And like I said, instead of scrolling through
Yeah.
TikTok, just look at these shopping websites. Just see what comes up.
Yeah, certainly more productive than like doom
Yeah.
scrolling on X or TikTok or
Mhm.
whatever. I think that probably a slightly better way to spend your time. Is there anything that you're like on the hunt for now? Like, do you have like a white whale that you're after? A lot of people listen to the podcast. Maybe someone would be willing to help if you're after something in particular. But I also don't want to like blow up your spot if there's something like really rare that you're like I think you're close to
Mhm.
getting. But like, what sort of things are you sort of like interested in? Like as of this
Yeah.
moment, to add to the
I
collection.
think that personally, what keeps me so interested in this realm of collecting is the spontaneity of it. I mean, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
everyone has their grail watches and things like that. But for me, I'm not ever really looking for anything in particular. Like my save searches, I'll have occasionally, like, I have a Seiko 6139 or a Seiko 6138 because I love that era of Seiko chronograph. But usually those, when those are posted, people know what they are. People know how much they're going to be.
Yeah.
People have done their research. If they're including a model number in the listing, they know. They know the value of the watch.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think
that might be like a red flag that you're dealing with someone who like knows too much to like get like
exactly.
a good deal. If they're like,
It's the exact same as like the car industry, used cars. You'll see listings for
Mhm.
stuff where some guy has a car listed for $500 and is like, I just need it gone. Like, I don't know what it is. Just get rid of it. It's on my property. I don't need it anymore. And then you have the
Right.
guys that are listing the exact same car for 10 grand saying, I know what I have. No tire kickers.
They have like the chassis
Yep.
number and the listing.
Yeah,
Like
they're making sure the VIN
they
matches
know
the engine block code and all that stuff. So it's you have
Yeah.
different areas of seller just as you have different areas of buyers. So personally, I'm not hunting anything in particular right now, but that is honestly what makes me so excited about collecting, is that ability to be like, whatever comes my way and I think it's cool, I'll buy it if it's relatively affordable.
Yeah. That's such a fun way to collect. I feel like it's like it's not how I currently
Mhm.
collect. Like I have like like realistically, like there are like certain watches that like I've identified that I
Mhm.
want, and like I can recall a time in my collecting life where frankly I was like more like you, and I would just kind of like it would be more spur of the moment happenstance, like when the opportunities arise, and like I kind of miss that
Mhm.
a little bit. I think it's like it's really easy to get sort of like almost like too deep into like refining your own collection, and there's something to be said, I think, for like the spontaneity.
Yeah, I
For
think
sure.
that some guys have a fantastic collection that is super specific to what they want to collect. one of my good friends is Joe, who does the Spring Bar podcast, and he
Mm-hmm.
collects devil divers and oceanographers and Bulova divers, and like I think that's incredible. I think his collection is fantastic. But then I look at my collection and I'm like, I would love to have some of those watches. But then would I want to give up a Seiko 6139? But I want to give up my Universal Geneve tank for that? Probably not. I like the ability to, at the change of a hat, be able to wear a diver from the 1970s or a dress watch made last year, or just the ability to change the watch with the outfit, change the watch with the mood, change the watch with the occasion.
Yeah.
Having the ability to have all these options is just what makes it fun to me personally.
Yeah, for sure. Tommy, this has been a really fun conversation. It's really great to kind of like get a window into like your view on collecting and these like incredibly unique watches that you're interested in. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We'll leave links to all of your articles, of course, in the show notes. But tell folks where they can find you on social media so they can give you a
thanks very much for having me and inviting me on here. It was a blast. You can find me on Instagram, Timekeeping Tommy. I recently, I think in the last like 6 months or so, changed my username, so some people don't even know that I exist anymore. But I assure you, I am real. I do exist. I still write for Worn and Wound. I still have my Instagram account. You can find me at Timekeeping Tommy on Instagram. And I post there whenever I have the chance, whenever I get something new in, whenever I see something, one of those weird oddities that I found on eBay, they always get posted there. So feel free to keep in touch and keep on the lookout for all those new posts that come out.
Yeah, honestly, like you're one of my favorite Instagram follows because like you really do like you'll be scrolling through and like you'll see like the same kind of stuff, like as you know how it is. Like you scroll through, you see like the same like handful of watches, but like you always have something like pretty unique.
Thank you.
On your feed, and like interesting commentary, like as well.
Thank you.
In the captions. Tommy, I ask guests to bring a cultural recommendation to the podcast whenever possible. Sometimes I forget, and we don't always include this section, but I remembered this time, and I asked you to think of something that you want to recommend to the community. Doesn't have to be watch related. In fact, sometimes it's better if it's not. But what's something you've enjoyed recently that you want to provide for our cultural rec?
Yeah, I think like a lot of us here at Worn and Wound on Instagram and watch collectors, we're also film buffs. So my cultural recommendation is Phantom of the Paradise. It has Paul Williams in it. I think it was written and directed by him as well. It's fantastic. It's a rock opera, kind of like Rocky Horror Picture Show, kind of like Shock Treatment, which was the sequel to Rocky Horror. I love that era of movie making. I love the rock opera because I love rock music. I love the cast that they're always in these types of movies. So yeah, Paul Williams, Jessica Harper's in it. Fantastic. I cannot recommend it enough.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I'm familiar with it. Like I know the movie, but I've never actually like sat down and watched it. It's a movie that's been recommended to me several times. So I definitely I'm gonna check that out. I also have a cultural recommendation. That's a movie this week. I actually just saw this movie last night and really enjoyed it. I saw Life of Chuck, the new Mike Flanagan film based on a Stephen King novella. Really like fantastic movie. I didn't quite know what to expect. I went in like almost completely blind. I was not familiar with the source material. I just knew that I'm like a pretty big Mike Flanagan fan. I've seen his series on Netflix. I thought that his Dr. Sleep adaptation was fantastic. I think one of the most underrated horror movies of the last like 10 years or so. Just really fantastic movie. So this has been on my radar for some time, but like I had no idea what to expect. The trailer made it look kind of bonkers. It is pretty bonkers. I won't like get into the plot because I think it's really best to go in like I did and not really know what you're getting into. But it has really great performances, really cool visual style, and I think if you like the Mike Flanagan kind of like writing style with a lot of sort of like extended monologues, you'll find just enough of that here. There's some really good ones. And I was just like very impressed by it. Really enjoyed it. I think it's going to be a little bit divisive. I could totally understand someone walking out of this movie and thinking it was garbage. Like I would not begrudge that position at all. But I quite liked it. There's also like I will say there's like a timekeeping component in this movie, so it's a possible future time on screen candidate, I think. So yeah, Life of Chuck. 2 movie recommendations this week on the podcast. Don't tell me there isn't value there. I think that's great. Tommy, thanks again for coming on the podcast. We really do appreciate it. Like I said, we'll leave links to all of your work in the show notes and also leave a link to your Instagram account. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for another episode of the Warner Wound podcast. We always appreciate it. And we will see you next week for another all new episode. Until then, take care.